Our story starts with a robot, and not this type of robot. Robot was the name of a dog belonging to a young teenager called Marcel in southwest France in 1940. And Marcel took Robot for a walk in the forest. Robot sniffed around a upturned tree, and as Marcel went to see what Robot was so interested in, he discovered that underneath the tree there was a cave. So he came back with 3 of his mates, and they descended down into this cave, and there they discovered an ancient art gallery, outstanding paintings from thousands of years before. Now, rather than critiquing the paintings, I'm just interested in what those artists used to create these works. Well, they used the pigments of their day, which later on the Greeks would refer to as ochre. So earth pigments that were red and yellow, and whatever they could burn they could make charcoal with. And they mixed these pigments together with the calcium-rich cave water, and they made a paste which they then applied to the cave walls. And that original paste, that was the start of art and is the same basis for making pastels today. Well, what is a pastel? In France, the word pastel means crayon. Now, these cave paintings we've seen were not made with crayons. In fact, the word pastel comes originally from Latin, and the word is pastelas, from which we get the word pasta, or dough, or paste. And paste is the original way of making paints. Getting some pigment and mixing it with a liquid and a binder to hold it together. Oil painting wouldn't be invented until the 7th century in Afghanistan. And it wasn't until the 12th century that Europe moved from using egg tempera with pigments for their painting. Well, can we really say that the first paintings, those cave paintings, were done by pastels and not by paints? Well, it depends if you like fighting over words or you're a snob about pastels. To me, it was very clear they made a paste, and pastels come from paste. They didn't have oils. They just used water, which was enriched with calcium, which today we use chalks and pastels, and they bound them together, and however they applied them, a pastel doesn't have to be mean just a stick or a pencil. It's referring to the pigment that's bound together from a paste. Now, the Egyptians, they loved art, and they took the pigment paste out of the caves and really into their tombs, but they also kept it on the outside as well of their buildings, so we can see outside Egyptian art. And they too were using paste, so they'd get their pigments. Some they even invented themselves. They created the first synthetic pigment, which is called Egyptian blue. And they would bind their pigments with egg tempera or gums. And much like a pastel painting, they would build up their pictures in layers. And so you have this layer of colour, and then you get a wash of another layer until they got their final result. But unlike pastel paintings today, which are often kept behind glass, you can see some of the glass reflecting behind me of my pastel paintings. The Egyptians used a varnish or a resin on top, which is what's kept their artwork so well preserved. Pastels do not like moisture. Those cave paintings that Marcel found, very quickly those caves were excavated and people were able to go and visit them. It was something like 1,200 people a day. But it didn't take long for all their breath, and no doubt they were smoking down there as well. And that started causing deterioration of the paintings. So now cave paintings, cave art, are much more carefully curated. I mentioned that it wasn't until the 12th century that Europe took off with oil painting. But really it was the Renaissance. In the 14th century, the Italians kick-started art on a massive scale because you could make money. And that makes sense. We'll do something that's going to make us money. And they started looking for a way to make art more portable so it could be sold and moved around. And someone in Venice looked out of their window and saw all those ships coming into harbour and thought, I know what I could use that canvas sail for. And so canvas was invented. And at the same time that we're getting oils starting to be mass produced, portable oil works, and you can think of the time and everyone wanted a painting. It was in vogue, get a portrait. And so one chap in France, his name was Jean, Leonardo refers to him as Jean de Paris, which just means Jean of Paris, just as Leonardo's name, Leonardo da Vinci, meant that Leonardo from Vinci, which was his birth town. So Jean was in much demand in Paris amongst the nobility for doing portraits, and he was like, how can I do this faster? And so he bound together his pigments and his paste with chalk. And he only came up with 3 colours, red, black and white. And that was enough to very quickly produce a whole lot of portraits, and thus he had good turnover and a good income. And he introduced these pastels to Leonardo. And Leonardo was absolutely fascinated by them. And in his notes of 1449 he writes, get from Jean de Paris the method of dry colouring. Dry colouring, that's cute, isn't it? How to make coated sheets. Learn the tempera of flesh tones. Learn to dissolve gum lake. He went on to improve these chalks, because of course Leonardo couldn't help himself. He'd take things and just improve on them. And he wrote his recipe as, mix the tempera with a little wax and it will not rub off. A wax that will dissolve with water. The distilled water will evaporate in steam and only the wax will remain. The colours must be ground on a hot stone. Yeah, quite the process of making his pastels. Well, the gum lake that Leonardo was referring to came from a long way away, modern day Iran. I'm sure it was called Persia back then. It had the common name goat's thorn, which comes from the Greek words tragos, meaning goat, and acantha, meaning thorn, and we call it tragacanth gum. Interestingly, it was also used for helping with coughs, so maybe they sucked it as a lozenge. I'm not entirely sure of how they fix their coughs. Pretty useful if you're dealing with pastel dust. So some of the best art supplies in the world were coming from the Middle East. There was tragacanth gum. If you couldn't afford tragacanth and you wanted something a little less fiddly to deal with, there was Arabic gum. And from Afghanistan, those inventors of oil painting, came the very best blue in the world, lapis. And we know it today as ultramarine, which just means from over the seas. Well, back to Leonardo. He moved from using pastels for doing outlines or cartoons of his paintings to doing whole paintings with them. And if this one doesn't look very colourful, it's because he had only learnt those 3 colours from Jean de Paris, red, white and black. The white pastel, however, It quickly got adopted by many artists of the time, and they used it for doing highlights on their paintings because it was so brilliant. As artists began experimenting with making new pastels, the medium began to develop. A German-born pastelist, Hans Holbein the Younger, I hope I didn't mangle his name too bad, Hans the Younger, he settled in London in 1532 and received the patronage of Henry VIII. By the 18th century, Francis Coates was doing a lot of portraits with pastels and achieving a beautiful delicacy and luminous skin tones. If we look at this painting, you'll notice there isn't much green in it. That's because green was really hard to make, and it was created by mixing yellow and blue pigments. Emerald green came out in 1814 and was an arsenic-based pigment, so blending would have been a bit of an adventure then. Fortunately, by 1859, viridian was invented, made of chromium oxide dihydrate. It had low toxicity. Still, even today, many artists are wary of getting pigments on their hands, and some pastelists prefer to wear gloves when doing their work. Well, some artists of the 18th century started getting a bit annoyed at this pastel medium, and they viewed it as unfashionable. Part of that was because pastels were in vogue just before the French Revolution. So a lot of nobles were getting their portraits done in pastel, and so the revolutionists didn't approve of that. But partly because some pastel painters could knock out their works 10 times faster than an oil painting, so they could have greater turnover and greater income than oil painters, and some got a bit snobby about that. Come the 19th century, there were a new breed of art innovators, and they couldn't give two figs about what people thought was in fashion or not. They went on to create a whole new way of seeing the world, and we call them the Impressionists. A peer of the Impressionists, Edgar Degas, took to pastels with a passion. And not since Leonardo has anyone innovated so much in how to use pastels. Quite literally, a star was born. Though Edgar turned out to be quite the divo. He had a mean temper. Outstanding artist, but a pretty tough person to be around, and drove all his other artists, peers and friends of the time away. However, he did inspire other artists of his time, and Gauguin, Monet, Renoir all used pastels. Renoir often did pastels for his friends. He didn't necessarily sell his pastel work, but he would do them for friends to sort of catch little moments of them, and the pastels really played to his strengths of playing with colour. One of Edgar Degas's friends, his few friends, was Mary Cassatt. He had admired a portrait of that she had done, and he introduced her to pastels, and she went on to produce phenomenal works of great delicacy. Here's one from 1888, William Merritt Chase. Beautiful painting, a study of flesh, colour and gold. Now, some critics say that if a canvas is covered completely, then it's a painting. But if parts are left uncovered, then it's a drawing. This is one of those things again of pigeonholing, trying to force standards upon artists. Many artists, pastelists, will use a particular coloured paper because they actually want to use that to shine through that tone of the coloured paper through their artwork. It's going to complement what they do. I'm not really into conformity. I think it's better to just create something and if it pleases you and pleases other people, fantastic. It doesn't have to fit a box. In fact, it's my experience that pastels have probably endured more snobbery than any other art form, with pigment-based art anyway. But I suppose the cave painters of their day, they would have had to put up with the critics of their day. Someone would have wandered into the cave and said, oh, that's not very realistic, or the proportions aren't right, or the colours are wrong. Why do you even keep painting bulls? Come out hunting with the rest of us. But it's experimentation, which is to me is at the foundation of art. Those cave painters were innovators. They were willing to experiment, to try something. You think of some of the innovators in art of our time, Picasso. He also had a crack at pastels. Beautiful work, by the way, if you ever get to look up his pastels. And he was pushing a local pastel maker to expand the range of colours available. So that was a nice contribution to pastel art. Degas, he would do all sorts of things to try and fix his work to the paper. Steam it, spray milk on it. He was just willing to experiment and see what would happen. A lot of the innovations in pastels were occurring in the 18th century as suppliers of paper and pigments started opening up the classic art store. And art stores really changed life for artists. You didn't have to make your own pigments anymore. Made life a lot easier. In fact, you know, it's said that when critics come and have a look at a painting, they talk about, you know, form and function and all the detail and what might it mean. But if you get a bunch of artists together, all they talk about is where to get the cheapest supplies. So Canson papers, they were the big mill house of the day of the 18th century, and houses like La Maison du Pastel, which manufactured the Roche pastels. They were crafting a huge range of colours. Because in some ways, pasteling hasn't changed since Egyptian times. Different layers of colour are applied either over each other or next to each other. So they're not mixed on a palette like oil paints. Today, the Roche, I guess it's the Roche factory, although I believe there's only 2 women producing the pastels there. The owner and an assistant. There's an amazing video on YouTube about the Roche pastels. They produce today over 2,000 colours, so plenty to play with for pastelists. Beyond colour, there's been a lot of innovation in recent times around papers to paint on. Kitty Wallace, an outstanding pastelist, invented a sanded paper, really gripped the pigment and enabled her to create beautiful paintings. Unfortunately, the quality proved to be a little difficult to maintain, so that paper is no longer available. However, other sanded papers have become popular, though the grit is often constructed of aluminium oxide and other chemicals to create the gritty surface. I personally like the innovation from Claire Fontaine. They created a paper called Pastel Mat. It's an organic surface derived from cellulose plant fibres that somehow they spray on. But the pastels stick firmly to the surface. It's not a perfect paper. If it gets scratched, it leaves a line that's really hard to conceal. But still an excellent innovation in paper. We have hundreds of pastel pencils now. Pastel pencils are fantastic. Create those fine details. My personal favourite innovation has been pan pastels. You don't pick it up with a stick or use it in a pencil, but rather use an applicator or a micro sponge to apply it. These are incredibly fine pigments mixed with minimal binder and filler, and they're much more like painting with palette knives. I wonder what Degas would have thought of them. I bet he would have loved them. Well, we've briefly skip through the ages. We began with the dawn of art, where pastels were invented first as a paste. Pigments mixed with a binder and water and then applied. We've looked at the Renaissance period where they sort of took off again with Leonardo and Jean de Paris, right through to the Expressionists. But where do we find pastels today? Well, unfortunately, they're almost back in the caves, with pastelists often still painting animals, just like they did in cave art, whether it be pets or animals from the wild. And pastels are still being viewed as unfashionable by framers who really don't like working with them, and other artists. So most artists I see on YouTube doing pastels are either doing pets, wildlife, impressionistic landscapes. There's nothing wrong with that work, but it just feels like it's been pigeonholed to me a little. I'd love to see more emotion and motion being expressed through pastels. It's such a versatile medium. Beautiful colours, all the vibrancy of oils, none of the mess, don't have to worry about varnishing at the end. So I really hope you've enjoyed this history of pastels, at least my view of the history of pastels. If you'd like to see more videos of me bringing emotion and motion to pastel painting, then please subscribe to the channel. If you just liked the video, happy with a thumbs up or a comment, always helps. And if you really liked it, then there's a link to buy me a coffee below, which I will use to buy more pastels. So thank you so much for being on the journey with me. I wish you success in your experimentation. Thank you for watching.